Hey everyone, welcome to the Beginning Swift workshop. We're going to wait just a couple minutes to see if anyone else arrives. And why don't we start off, if you have access to the chat, why don't you go ahead and let me know where you're here from. Can everyone hear me okay? Hope so. Oh, someone's here from Germany. Cool. Charlotte, North Carolina. Cool. Good deal. So as we go along, you can use the Q&A in Google Hangouts to type in any questions that you have. And I won't be able to hear you, but if you type your questions in there, I can read them that way. So someone here from Boston, cool. Dallas, Texas, Spain, awesome. Good deal. Okay, well, I don't want to waste any more time, so let's jump in and get started. So this is a beginning Swift workshop, and my assumption is that you have a little bit of experience with iOS development already. If you don't, that's fine, but it might be hard for you to keep up. This is going to move pretty quickly, and we're going to go through a lot of things very quickly. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we'll jump in and look at what we're going to be building today. So hopefully now you can see the screenshot of the app that we're going to work on today. And I called it Swift Top Movies. And this is an app to list the top movies from the iTunes RSS feed. We're going to work with UI TableView, NSURL session, NSJSON serialization, closures, optionals, and of course we'll have some fun today. So that's the end goal here, this app, and hopefully we can get it all done in the hour that we're here. So I'm going to check and see if there are any other questions. If you have any questions, any issues, does this all sound good? Cool. All right, so let's jump into Xcode, and you'll need Xcode 6 Beta 5 for this, so make sure you have that. And if not, go download it really quickly here. But we'll go into Xcode. We're going to create a new single view application. So it's just going to have one screen. I'm going to call this Top Movies. And you can kind of skip over the organization name and identifier. Those might be required, but it doesn't matter what those are for now. Make sure that your language is Swift and your device is set to iPhone. We're going to skip core data for today, so make sure that box is unchecked as well. If at any point this is going too quickly for you, you can ask me to slow down, and I'll try to monitor the Q&A in Google Hangouts there. All right. So we're going to create the Top Movies app. It's just going to go on my desktop. I'll hit create. and boom, we should have an app. You should see an app delegate, a view controller, and a main storyboard. Okay. So first of all, let's go to the storyboard and we'll build our UI in there. So I will move some of these panels out of my way. So as it is now, it's just a view controller with a white screen, blank screen. This is the entry point into our storyboard, or in this case, our entire app. So we know that this is the first screen that's going to show up in our app. I'm actually going to delete that, and we're going to go with a navigation controller. So if you select the view controller there and hit delete, it's gone. And then I'm going to drag out a navigation controller here. So go to your objects panel in the bottom right, drag a navigation controller onto the screen. And with that navigation controller is a TableView controller. Those come together. We can get rid of the TableView controller and change it if we want to, but that's by default how they come. So this TableView controller is going to be the screen in our app, and remember the title's Top Movies from that screenshot we saw earlier. So we'll double click there and say Top Movies. You can select the cell, make sure that TableView cell selected over in the left panel, and then we're going to set its style to basic. So this is just a basic TableView cell. It has a title on it. That's it. And now you can see that title there as well. While we're here, we need to set the identifier. We're going to use this in our code later. So I'm going to set the identifier to cell, making sure to save my storyboard afterwards. And that's it for the UI part of it. We'll jump back into the code and connect some things that way. So first things first, we need to go to our view controller. And if you've done Objective-C, this is going to look a little bit different, but should be fairly familiar. So our class is called ViewController. It extends UI ViewController. We actually want it to extend UI TableViewController, so we're going to change that. Okay, so our view controller now extends UI TableViewController. This colon in Swift means extends. All right. So now we need to hook up our storyboard to point to this class. So when that table view gets displayed in the app, this class is the code that's going to be executed on behind it. So I'll jump to the main storyboard again, select my table view controller, which is called root view controller over here in my left panel. And then I'm going to change the class from, it should be grayed out UI table view controller. I'm going to change it to view controller. And notice that I get code completion there. You should as well. If not, something's probably wrong. You probably didn't extend UI table view controller in your view controller class. Okay, so let's jump back into the view controller, and there are a few methods that we need to override on UI table view controller in order to display some content in our view. So if you've done Objective-C, you're well aware of these methods here. First of all is number of sections in table view. This tells the table view how many sections should be displayed in it. So if you start typing number, Xcode should help you out and fill out the rest of it. And if you hit enter there, it's there. Notice in Swift as well that these overrides are required for methods. When you're subclassing and overriding a method, you need to specify the override keyword. Methods are called actually functions in Swift as well. So func is the keyword there. And then this is the method name. So pretty self-explanatory there. Then we have a parameter of TableView, called TableView, sorry, and its type is UI TableView. And so we're getting a UI TableView into this method, and then we're going to specify how many sections are in it. The exclamation point at the end means that it's an optional, but that it's implicitly unwrapped, which means it's just easier to access it. But it is an optional, meaning that it could have a nil value or it might not. Generally, the exclamation point is used when you know that the optional is no longer going to be nil after a certain point. And then the arrow symbol indicates the return type, and then the return type here is int. So we just need to return some integer telling the table view how many sections should be displayed. So I'm going to return 1 for mine. The next method to override is TableView number of rows in section, and I'm just going to scroll down to it here. Way down. So TableView number of rows in section is this method name. If we return 5 there, that'll give us 5 rows in our table view. And this should look similar to the method signature above. We have TableView for the method name. First parameter is TableView. This number of rows in section is the external parameter name. So when calling this method, you need to specify that name in the method call. We'll look at that a little bit later as well. Number of rows in section, and then section. So section is the internal parameter name. So that's the variable that we get to use inside of the method. That's an int, and then this one also returns an int. We're returning 5 there. So that's the number of sections, number of rows. We need to return a cell as well from the table view, and this is where it gets a little bit different from Objective-C. So still the same method name, TableView, cell for row at index path. And we can still use the table view to dequeue a reusable cell. So I'll say let cell equal TableView.dequeue reusable cell with identifier for index path. We need that second part for index path as well. So the identifier matches what's in our storyboard, which we called it cell over there. And then the index path, we're getting the index path in this method as a parameter, so we'll just use that one. So here's an example of calling a method that has a named parameter, a named external parameter. So it's dequeue reusable cell with identifier for index path. That's the whole method name. Okay, and then we need to return the cell from this method. Now, Xcode's going to complain about this because the type is not correct on the cell. It wants us to return a UI table view cell from this method, and currently cell is typed as an any object, which means it could be any object. It's similar to ID in Objective-C. So I'm going to cast it up here, and to cast I use as. So UI table view cell. And then this let here defines a constant. In Swift we have constants and variables. Let is a constant, var is a variable. So this cell is a constant, it's not going to change. We're not going to set cell to anything else afterwards. Okay, and then I like to define a ConfigureCell method to set the text on the cell and any other customization that we might want. So I'm just going to call the method right now, and then we'll define it in a minute. I'm going to say ConfigureCell. I'm going to pass in the cell, and I'm going to say at index path for the second part of the method name, and then I'll pass in the index path. Okay, so if you've done table views in Objective-C, this should also be familiar. You've probably implemented a ConfigureCell method similar to this. I'll pause for just a minute, make sure you're caught up with me here. Okay, Let's define that ConfigureCell method if you haven't already. So it's just a function called ConfigureCell. It takes in a cell, and that cell is of type UI TableView cell. Okay, and then it's the second part of its method name, the external parameter name from up here is called @indexPath. Okay, so we're going to say @indexPath. That's how we call it. And then indexPath is the internal name of that parameter. And then the type of that is going to be an NS index path. Okay. So to configure the cell, we're just going to set the text on it. Cell.textLabel.text equals hello. For now, that should be all we need to display a table view with 5 rows and hello in each row, in each cell. Let's see if it works. Okay, works for me. Hopefully you made it to this point as well. 5 rows in our table view. It says hello on each row. Good. And someone's asking why they're not getting any code completion, for example, for DQ reusable cell. It could be because of Xcode 6 beta. It also could be because there's a syntax error somewhere else. If at this point, Xcode 6, if there's a syntax error somewhere in the code, it's not great about providing code completion in other places. Okay. So hopefully we're all at the same point now, have our table view displaying static data. Now, to do the dynamic data, I've recently become aware of a pattern called MVVM, and that stands for Model View View Model. And I'm a huge fan of it because it declutters my view controllers. I found that often I end up dealing with massive view controllers, and a lot of people have written about this in the Objective-C community lately. And I don't like having view controllers that are, for example, 800, 900 lines, and MVVM allows me to reduce the size of the view controllers and get some of that code out into a ViewModel class. So at this point, we're going to create a ViewModel, and we'll ask the ViewModel for a lot of this data that we're providing here. So I'm going to define a constant for the instance of this class. I'm going to call it ViewModel. And I'm going to just initialize it right away. Okay, so let ViewModel equal ViewModel. This is going to be our new ViewModel class, which doesn't exist yet, which is why Xcode doesn't like it. Okay, so now we're going to go to the top movies group, create a new file. You can choose Swift file there. Okay, I'm going to call it ViewModel. Now, if I were building a larger app, I'd probably be more specific about which ViewModel this is. I might call it Movies ViewModel, and then there may be other ViewModels as well in the app. For today, ViewModel, there's only going to be one, so ViewModel is good enough for the name. Okay, and the ViewModel needs to be a class. Class ViewModel. And now our view controller should be a little bit happier. Indeed it is. Okay, so this is a point where we start asking the ViewModel for this information that we're just returning. the static data. So for the number of sections, I like to say ViewModel.number of item or of sections. Okay. So I'm just going to ask the ViewModel for the number of sections. I don't need to give the ViewModel the table view in this case like we're getting in this method, because the ViewModel only applies to this particular view controller and only one table view. So we're going to go now into the ViewModel and define this number of sections method. So I'll jump into the ViewModel, define a new function, number of sections, and it takes no parameters, but it does return an int. Okay, and that we're only going to have one section in our table view, so we can return 1 from this method. Moving other things out of our view controller, let's go to the number of rows in section method. So here, instead of returning 5, we'll ask our ViewModel. It's not going to be a number of sections, but it is going to be number of items in section. And we'll pass in the section. I need to work on my capitalization here. Of items in section. There we go. So our ViewModel is going to have another function called number of items in section. It's going to take a parameter of section, which is just an int, as we can see above, and it's going to return an int. So let's go to the ViewModel and do that. Okay, it takes one parameter called section, and that is an int, and it returns an int. And we'll just go with some static data for now. We'll return 5. We'll get to the dynamic stuff in a little bit. Okay, and then one more place that I like to ask the ViewModel for data is in this ConfigureCell method. So instead of returning hello or setting it to hello, we'll just ask the ViewModel for item at index path. Okay, and then you can imagine if we were going to set a subtitle here, we could ask the ViewModel for the subtitle at the index path. And we could set that on the detail text label for the cell. But today, just the title. So back into the ViewModel, define another function. For item at index path, it's going to take in an index path, which is of type NSIndexPath, and that one's going to return a string. I'll say return hi for now. Change it up a little bit. We can run it and then see that our data should all be displayed there. It's hi now instead of hello. Still have 5 rows. Everything's good. Did everyone make it that far? Hopefully we did. Please post if you have questions right now. Okay, sounds like we're doing all right. So now I'm going to jump into the ViewModel, and we're going to start actually getting some data to work with here. Instead of the static stuff that we have, let's get some real data. And actually, that reminds me, in our view controller, back there, in the viewDidLoad method, let's ask the ViewModel to go ahead and fetch the movies that we want to display. So ViewModel.fetch. I guess we've called them items in other places. So we're going to ask it to fetch items, and then we're going to specify this closure here. And the closure is what should get executed after the items are fetched. Okay, so after the ViewModel fetches the items, we're going to need to reload the data on the table. So we can call dispatch async, use grand central dispatch. And we need to make sure that we call this on the main queue, so dispatch get main queue. And then we can specify the block here that we want to execute. Now, another way to do it is to use trailing closures, which we've actually done here already with this fetch items. We're specifying a trailing closure. So the last closure can be created outside of the parentheses. So we're going to do that here. And then we don't need to end this with a closing parentheses like we always had to do with blocks in Objective-C. We can just wrap the closure inside of the curly braces. So self.tableview.reload data. After we fetch the items on the ViewModel, let's reload the data, and then we'll ask the ViewModel for the number of sections, number of items, etc. Okay, so of course we need to go define this method. And this one's going to be a little bit more interesting because it takes in a closure as a parameter. So I'll define a fetch items method. Okay, and then I'll call this just success for the closure that's going to be passed into this method. So the syntax for accepting a closure as a parameter is parentheses, the return arrow, and then parentheses. Okay, and then if we wanted to have our closure accept parameters, we could do that here. We could put in parameters here, and then this would be the return type of the closure, again indicated by the return arrow. So now we get to fetch the items. So to do that, we're going to need the link, the URL to the iTunes feed, which is here in my browser. Let's see if I can paste it for you. I don't know if I can. Hopefully you can see that in Google Hangouts. I don't know if it'll give you the URL or if it's just going to paste the data, but if you haven't already copied it down yourself, typed it out, go ahead and do that real quick. And I'm going to take this and bring it into my code. Okay, so I'll say let URL string equal quotes, and then the URL string. Okay, so in order to fetch our items, we need to use an SURL, an SURL session, and we need to do some JSON parsing. So that's what we're going to do, all of that right inside of this method. So URL equal NSURL, and then we'll call the init method with a string on NSURL. So this is going to look a little bit different from Objective-C as well, if you've done that. In Objective-C, this would be NSURL URL with string, that factory method. So Swift is a little different. Just need the parentheses after the class name and then pass in the parameter. We need to create an NSURL session as well. So we're We're going to say let session equal NSURL session. And just like we created the URL with the parentheses after the class name, we're going to do that here. So we'll pass in a configuration. I'm going to use the default one. So it's NSURL session configuration.default session configuration. Okay. Need the data task. Again, if you've done NSURL sessions, you're familiar with this. So session.data task with URL, and we want the completion handler as well here. Okay, so we'll pass in our URL. And again, we can leave off we don't need the completion handler parameter name. We can just use the trailing closure syntax, which I much prefer. So I'm going to do it that way. So data, response, and error are the parameters for our closure. It returns nothing, so we actually don't even need to specify void for the return type. And then the in separates the closure's parameters from its body. So that's what this in means here. So we're going to create the data task, and then once it's completed, this is the completion block, we need to parse the JSON. So, of course, we need a JSON error, which is an NS error optional. Okay, so this is because JSON error may be nil. That's what the optional means. May be nil, may have a value. In this case, it is nil because we're not initializing it to anything. We're going to say let JSON equal NS JSON serialization, JSON object with data. Pass in the data. Pass in nil for the options. And we'll pass in the JSON error pointer. So this is a little bit weird about Swift right now. This may change at some point, but you can see the type here is NS error pointer, and we're going to pass in ampersand JSON error, which is an optional NS error type. Okay, and Xcode doesn't like that we're getting an any object back from that. And actually, we don't like it either. It's going to be easier for us to work with an NS dictionary here. So we're going to cast that to an NS dictionary. Okay. Now, Swift has this concept of optional binding. And since this JSON error is an optional, again, it may be nil or it may have a value. If it's nil, then we know there wasn't an error. If it's non-nil, then there was some error. So we can unwrap that optional using the if-let syntax. So we can say if-let unwrapped JSON error. Okay, so it's a little bit tricky to understand at first. I know I kind of struggled with it at first, but so we're going to unwrap this JSON error optional, and it's going to be assigned to this unwrapped error constant. Okay, and then so if we get an error, if we have an error, this block right here is going to be executed. Okay, so for now, this is definitely not a good long-term solution, but for now we'll print that there was an error. Okay. If there was an error, we'll just print it out. Else, let's work with that JSON. Let's parse it. So here's where we want probably an instance variable to hold the JSON, the value that we parse out of it. So I'm going to call it self.titles JSON value for key path. Now, knowing this key path is just a matter of knowing your JSON, right? So we'll go quickly and look back at the JSON here. Notice that we get a feed. It has an entry, which is an array. And then inside of that, there's this IAmName label. So we're going to use all of those keys to parse out the JSON that we want. And it's going to return an array since entry was an array there. So it's feed.entry IAM:name.label. Okay, and self.titles is not defined anywhere. We need to create an instance variable for that. So it's var titles equals, and then we can just initialize a string array. Okay, and our compiler's still not happy here because value for key path returns any object, again, ID in Objective-C, but any object in Swift. So we need to cast that. This is, again, probably not a good long-term solution, but since we know what the JSON is going to look like and we know that we're going to get an array back, we'll just go ahead and cast it here. We can say as string. And string inside of brackets because it's a string array. Okay. So now instead of returning a constant variable here, we can just use our titles array. Say titles count. And the title for the item at the index path will be in our titles array. Well, we'll just use the row from the index path. So I'll give you a second to go ahead and type that in. You can try running it. Hopefully this is all we need to get it working, but we may have missed something. I'm not sure. I'm going to run mine. See if we get anything. And for me, I'm getting blank table view. Anyone else? Okay. So let's go in and see what's going on. If you haven't done debugging yet in Objective-C, you can just click on the line numbers over on the left to set a breakpoint. What I want to see is whether our success block is getting called, and that should help here. Actually, I do think that's the issue. Okay, so our success block wasn't even called. So in our view model, we need to make sure we call that success block, success closure after we've parsed the JSON. So in the success case, of course. And of course, I forgot to call that. In addition to forgetting to call that, I also forgot to kick off the task. So kick off the URL request. So that's task resume. So this kicks off the request. This closure is executed when we receive a response. And then if there wasn't an error, we call success. I see in the Q&A someone asked, what's the better way to parse and handle JSON, not casting using as. Chris Eidhoff wrote a really good article about parsing JSON, and he defined some custom operators. And so the way we're doing our JSON parsing here is just sort of dynamic. And his Chris Eidhoff's parser uses the static typing and type safety in Swift to do it. So his approach is a much better one. It's a little more complicated, and honestly, I don't fully understand it, but certainly a better approach would be to go that route. Another approach would be to use the if-let syntax to unwrap each value and check whether it's of the type that you expect it to be. Those are two good options, but you can check each type to see, is it a dictionary, is it array, is it a string, whatever, as you go through your JSON tree. So at this point, hopefully you've caught up and typed in all this code here. I'm going to run my app again and make sure that it's working now. And I am hitting my breakpoint now, which is a good thing, actually multiple times. There we go. Okay, so there it is. There are our top movies. And there we have it. We've built an app in Swift in less than an hour. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of what Swift is like, what you can do with it, how it works, and hopefully you have a good understanding too of how to use it with the Objective-C APIs, like the TableView cell for row index path, a number of rows in section. Yeah, I hope this was a good overview, especially if you've done Objective-C, for you to kind of get a good idea of what Swift is like. So with that, I will open it up to questions. If you want to see any of the code, do let me know in the Q&A. I can leave the ViewModel up for now, and if you want to see the ViewController, just let me know. Post any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll open it up for those right now. I see an earlier question from Chris that says he got caught up and missed a bit. Will this be sent to us to view later? Yes, you'll get a link to this recording later, and you'll also get a link to the code on GitHub. So either way you want to do it, if you want to rewatch this thing, you can do it later. If you want to look at just look at the source code on GitHub, that'll be there as well. Let me know what other questions you have. I will jump into the ViewController again, so if you missed any of the code there, you can copy it down. And as you're looking at that, just to kind of wrap up, if you want to learn iOS in more depth, you can join me in the iOS Bootcamp, which is happening next Friday, August 22nd. There are a few seats left for that, and we'll talk about view controllers in more depth. We'll talk about table views, we'll do more networking, and you'll just get to learn a lot of the concepts of iOS in more depth. One of the things we didn't cover today at all was the app delegate. We talk about that in the bootcamp. So there's just a lot more in-depth stuff that you'll learn in the bootcamp. It's a full day versus just an hour like we had here. So there's a lot more that we cover there. And if you feel like you already know iOS, if you're already an iOS developer, already know Objective-C and know the APIs, you might be interested in the exercise program that I'm offering as well. And that's a 4-week program where over the course of 4 weeks, you build an app. And in those 4 weeks, you get assignments from me. You can ask me questions via email, and you can ask me questions in our live office hours. So it's a great way to get more practice with Swift, get more hands-on experience with it if you haven't done much in it. And the app is already scoped for you, so you don't have to worry about trying to scope a project and getting, figuring out how much you can do in a short time period. So that's another option as well. If you're on the mailing list, you'll get an email about that along with the links from today's recording. So get on the mailing list if you're not and you're interested in that, and I'll send you more information. I'm going to take, let's see, Michael's asking if I can scroll down to title for item at index path, and I indeed can do that. I assume we're talking about in the view model here, so I will go there. If that's not it, ask another question and be happy to show you the other code. VJ has a good question. He's asking, it says, interesting intro to MVVM. I may be oversimplifying, but is it basically allocating a dedicated object to handle some of the delegate data source methods versus having a massive view controller? Yes, indeed, it is. And it's separating some of the, so with MVVM, to the best of my knowledge, it's separating out, the view-related code should all go in your view controller. And so, for example, if in our view controller we wanted to set the background color of our cells or the text color or any of the color-related or UI-related properties, those belong in the view controller. If we want to synthesize strings to be displayed, sort of like what we're doing here, to show our titles and things like that, then I think those sorts of things belong in the view model. And that's, to my knowledge, I guess that's the best of my understanding of MVVM. Have another question. Can we scroll lower on UI view controller? Or sorry, just view controller, I can indeed. Hopefully that shows you what you need to see there. We have 12 more minutes, so feel free to keep posting questions and I'll do my best to get to them. Robert would like to see the storyboard and show the class setting. Indeed, we can go back to that. So in the main storyboard, if you select the TableView controller, which now is called Top Movies for me, and then in the third tab from the left, in the right panel over here, set the custom class to View Controller. Let's see, other questions. Do I prefer using method or properties for ViewModel and why? I'm not sure I quite understand that question. So if you want to expand on that a little bit or ask it a different way, I'd be happy to answer. Yeah, and that value for key path is something you can use in Objective-C as well. That's part of the Objective-C API. So if you, sorry, I didn't read the question for anyone who's not seeing them, but they're saying thanks for value for key path. It's much nicer than kind of using the square bracket syntax, which, yeah, that's something that works really well. It works all over the place in dictionaries and arrays and even on your classes and accessing their properties. So value for key path is a very powerful method. And again, you can use that both in Swift and Objective-C. Please show bottom of ViewController. Here it is again. Okay, so Constantine's asking if I prefer using methods or properties for ViewModel and why. I generally prefer using methods there, and that's because a lot of times the functionality in my ViewModel it's not always just a property. It's not always just a certain value. But sometimes I have to synthesize things, combine values from different attributes. So I usually use methods for my ViewModel. I hope that explains why as well. X of Dyer asks, did I upgrade to beta 5? Yes, indeed. This is in Xcode 6 beta 5. So if you're on a different beta, you probably will have issues since things are changing rapidly in Swift. Constantine asks, in the ViewModel class, you have 3 methods, number of sections, etc. What if we make them properties? Would it be better for Arc? Well, we could make them properties. Well, I guess I'm not sure. I suppose we could make them properties and set like titles.count to the property. I'm not sure that buys us a whole lot. I don't think it's necessarily better for Arc. I don't have a great answer for that, but I don't think properties really buy us a whole lot here. I think the methods are just fine. Michael would like to see the view model, which is what we're looking at right here. Hopefully you see that. Well, we have just a few more questions, but again, I want to thank you all for being here. I appreciate you joining me today and working with me through Swift. It's been a lot of fun. Again, if you want to learn more, you can do that in the iOS Bootcamp, which is next Friday. So you got to get your ticket for that soon, and you'll be able to see where to get that on the mailing list. Constantine meant rack for reactive Cocoa. Thanks for the answers. So I think we're talking about ViewModel properties for reactive Cocoa. Reactive Cocoa is not something I've used myself yet, so I don't know. Reactive Cocoa might be happier with properties rather than functions for the ViewModel. I don't know. I'd have to look into that. If I'm not able to get to your question today, please feel free to send me an email about it. And you should be on the mailing list. You'll get an email from me soon. So you can just hit reply to that. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask me that way. And I'll do what I can to help you out and help you get this app built and finished. Again, you do need to be on the latest beta of Xcode 6, which currently is Xcode or beta 5. Okay, and I see someone's asking about the default session configuration and title and unresolved identifiers. Without being able to see your code, I'm not sure I can tell you anything. The code that I have here should work in beta 5. If you're not on beta 5, that may explain why you have the unresolved identifiers. I'm not sure about that. Let's see. Where is default session configuration declared? Someone's asking. That is on NSURL session configuration. It's a class method or function on NSURL session configuration. So you do need to type NSURL session configuration dot default session configuration in order to get that to work. All right. Well, it looks like I've answered most of the questions here. Again, feel free to email me on the list. You'll get an email from me in the near future with links to this. So thanks again for being here. I appreciate it. And I'll see you again sometime. Bye.